Today, we're unpacking the invisible gears of the modern housing market. We're going to pull apart the blueprints of a system that impacts, well, millions of us. We'll be looking strictly at the data, the demographics, and those hidden costs that literally dictate who gets to live where. If you've ever wondered why building affordable homes seems so incredibly difficult and, quite frankly, expensive, you are absolutely in the right place.
Okay, let's dive into this. There's a recent headline from an NYU Urban Lab report that states, affordable housing is an oxymoron. I mean, it sounds totally counterintuitive, right? But the data reveals a shocking reality here. Government-sponsored, subsidized housing projects frequently cost nearly twice as much per unit to build as your standard market-rate housing. So we're essentially attempting to solve an affordability crisis with a system that inherently inflates the actual cost of construction. No way, right?
To really see how this plays out, just consider the soft costs in California. Soft costs are basically all the expenses not directly tied to physical bricks and mortar. So think legal fees, financing, consulting, the whole shebang. For market-rate housing, these sit right around $84 per square foot. But for affordable housing, they skyrocket to an average of $187 per square foot. That staggering gap right there is the absolute crux of our housing paradox, and it's exactly where our journey today begins.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, the affordable housing paradox. Second, who are ELI renters? Third, a 7.2 million home shortfall. Fourth, why building costs so much. Fifth, the zoning roadblock. And finally, blueprints for change.
All right, let's get into section 1, the affordable housing paradox. Look at these numbers. They're just fascinating. And look, this isn't just a California problem. In Boston, the average cost for large affordable projects reached $678,000 per unit. That is 43% higher than market rate equivalents. Even down in Texas, a state generally known for lighter regulations and faster approval times, the soft costs for affordable housing are still nearly 3 times higher than market rate projects. We're talking $60 per square foot compared to just $22. So across the board, coast to coast, the very structures we're building to be affordable are suffering from severe cost inflation. Moving on to section 2, who are ELI renters? Before we get totally lost in the numbers, we need to understand exactly who we're actually talking about. In housing policy, everything revolves around specific metrics, and the most critical one here is ELI. That stands for extremely low income. These are households with incomes at or below either the federal poverty guideline or 30% of the area median income, whichever is higher. To put that into perspective, out of the nation's 46 million renter households, 11 million of them fall into this ELI category. That's nearly 1/4 of the entire rental market.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the data completely dispels common myths about who low-income renters actually are. Looking at the breakdown, 34% are actively in the labor force, often working full-time in low-wage jobs. Another 33% are seniors, and 18% are individuals with disabilities. The rest includes students and single adult caregivers. So we aren't talking about some marginal group here, we are talking about the working poor, our elderly, and the disabled.
And this leads us to a pretty devastating reality known as shelter poverty. Let's look at residual income, which is just the money you have left over after paying rent. A severely cost-burdened ELI family of 4 paying average rent might have only $930 left for the entire month. But according to the USDA, a basic thrifty food budget for that family costs $992. So after just rent and basic food, they're already in the negative. Literally $0 left for healthcare, transportation, or childcare.
Which brings us to section 3, a 7.2 million home shortfall.
7.2 million. I really want to emphasize this single massive number. Just let that sink in for a second. This is the absolute national shortage of affordable and available rental homes for extremely low-income households right now. And the crazy thing is, this number is actually conservative. It doesn't even fully capture the hundreds of thousands of individuals currently experiencing homelessness or those having to double up with other families just out of pure necessity.
You see, the housing market works very differently depending on your paycheck. As you move up the income ladder, your housing options obviously expand. For renters earning under 80% of the median income, there are 88 available homes for every 100 renters. But at the bottom, for every 100 extremely low-income renters, only 35 affordable and available homes even exist. So they're forced to compete for this tiny sliver of the market, which inevitably pushes them into apartments they simply cannot afford. It's like a brutal game of musical chairs.
And because of this intense competition, 74% of ELI renters are severely cost-burdened. That means they spend more than half of their income just on rent and utilities. When we think about modern, dense urban apartment blocks, we really have to connect that abstract statistic to the physical reality on the ground. These buildings represent markets where the lowest income renters are entirely priced out of their own neighborhoods. They're living in a constant state of financial emergency.
Okay, Section 4. Why building costs so much? Let's dissect this.
A huge part of the problem is the convoluted funding structure we rely on, primarily the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit or LIHTC program. It's basically a giant maze for developers. First off, these tax credits only cover a fraction of a project's cost. Second, developers have to cobble together multiple complex funding sources to make up the difference. And every single source comes with its own set of rules, which explodes soft costs like legal and consulting fees to over 25% of the total budget. Finally, developer fees are often calculated as a percentage of total costs, so this perversely incentivizes developers to actually maintain higher rather than lower overall budgets. Make it make sense, right?
And the private market isn't naturally bailing us out either. Historically, we relied on this concept of filtering, where older homes naturally depreciate and become cheaper over time. But in today's constrained market, that downward filtering has totally stalled. Actually, scratch that, it's reversed. Instead of older units becoming affordable, landlords in tight markets are incentivized to renovate and upgrade their older stock to charge higher rents. This completely cuts off the natural supply of lower-cost housing.
Let's move to Section 5, the zoning roadblock.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive tension we're seeing on the ground. Integrating dense multifamily housing into a neighborhood is, in many communities, actually illegal to build. Local land use regulations and restrictive, large-lot, single-family zoning laws strictly dictate what can be built and exactly where. So by prohibiting dense apartments, especially in well-resourced higher-income areas, local zoning artificially chokes off the housing supply, which drives up costs for absolutely everyone.
All right, our final segment, Section 6, Blueprints for Change.
Up in Washington, we're seeing two very different architectural approaches to this crisis. Data from recent housing reports notes that the Trump administration focused heavily on deregulation, proposing historic budget cuts to HUD, reducing federal housing staff, and rolling back requirements like the 30-day eviction notice just to cut red tape. Conversely, Congress has taken a different route. We've seen bipartisan action rejecting those proposed cuts in the recent FY26 spending bill, focusing instead on maintaining and actually expanding direct programmatic funding. So the crucial point is that there are very diverse legislative solutions currently on the table. You've got the Road to Housing Act and the Housing for the 21st Century Act, which attempt to tie federal funding directly to local zoning changes. There's the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, aiming to streamline that super complicated LIHTC maze we just talked about. You have proposals for 250,000 new vouchers to directly help families, and massive structural proposals like the American Housing Act, which suggests investing $445 billion into a national public trust fund over 10 years. But when we look at the complete picture, while reforming local zoning laws is fantastic for increasing the general supply of market-rate housing, it isn't a silver bullet. Because the math of building is so incredibly expensive, the private market simply cannot build homes cheaply enough for the working poor and seniors. Targeted, deeply subsidized federal assistance remains absolutely crucial. It's a desperately needed piece of the puzzle for those 11 million ELI renters whose needs just can't be met by the private market alone.
Which brings us to our final thought. The affordability paradox isn't some undeniable law of physics, right? It's a product of policy, financing rules, and local zoning boards. We know exactly who is hurting. We know the math behind why it costs so much, and the blueprints for change are sitting right there on the table. The housing crisis is, ultimately, a systemic choice. So the question we have to ask our own communities is this: we know the math, will we rewrite the rules? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I highly encourage you to go look up the zoning laws in your own neighborhood and see what's really being built around you. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.